Hi, everybody. I'm Radhika Roy. I'm a gender economist and the CEO and founder of Pipeline. All right. We were going to show a video, but we are not going to show video. We're going to go right into the panel. All right. So, Radhika, the video that we were going to show, in it, the World Economic Forum estimated it will take another 136 years to achieve gender equality. Is the convergence of these crises, climate, pandemic, energy crises, and economic inequality, the right time to truly transform? What trends are you seeing?
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad there's not a waterfall behind us. I mean, the one thing that has not come up in the last 2 days is the pandemic. And that has had such an impact on gender equality that we've never seen before. I mean, just think about it. 2 years ago, the world economy came to a standstill at the same time. We've never seen that, and we need an analysis to understand what happens when the entire world economy stops. So a couple of the issues that come up in terms of gender inequality is it exposed the importance of the care economy in the economy. Right? During the pandemic, at 7 o'clock, everyone went and clapped their hands about, the healthcare workers, the people at home. But that didn't change the importance of care in our economy. It also exposed the work of unpaid care work. When schools were closed and suddenly children were at home, nobody knew what to do about it. And just a couple of numbers. Globally, 16.4 billion hours of unpaid care work takes place. That's equal to 2 billion people working 8 hours a day with remuneration. And that would be about $11 trillion USD, right? That's the estimate of unpaid care work. So I think when we talk about where are we is 162 years or whatever, what we need is, and I'm going to use the F word, we need a feminist economic analysis about how the economy works that puts care at the center of how we evaluate the economy. And I have to say the UK Women's Budget Group has some great work that talks about what do we need to have a caring economy. And that means macroeconomic policy.
Too many things around me. So can you, globally, public and economic policies leave women behind? This is for you again, Radhika.
Okay, I think they were going to,
okay.
People wanted to jump in on some of that? Or?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think the only thing I can say to follow on from that really is that if this isn't the time to do it, when is? Exactly, when do we do this? The convergences that you spoke about around these issues, they've been converging for a long time. They didn't converge on the back of the pandemic. They're all interlinked, actually. You cannot achieve climate justice without gender justice. You cannot achieve climate justice without economic justice. And I think we have to learn in this moment from the financial crisis and the fact that we returned to not just what was wrong before the financial crisis within our economic systems, but actually it deepened. We had the rollout of austerity policies across the globe, and these were justified on the back of the financial crisis. And this has actually created an even worse environment for the pandemic to then come and wreak its havoc and its consequences on everybody, including women. Following the pandemic, actually, there were a rash of feminist treaties and calls to action and statements. And you can find all of these, actually, on the Gender and Development Network website. They've collated them all there, so please do go and have a look. And I think this is the time where we actually start looking at how we can lose momentum very quickly and make sure that does not happen.
I'd also just like to follow up exactly on Fatimah and Radhika's point by stressing that the pandemic has also really exposed the question of intersectionality and the way that we need to look at intersectionality in a structural manner in which all the registers of identity from race, class, physical disability, sexuality, ethnicity are mutually determining. And so when we say that gender inequality has been exacerbated by the pandemic and by the kind of structural flaws and failures of our economic system, it happens on the scales of intersectionality, where women of color, women in developing countries across the global south, poorer women, those who are structurally excluded and marginalized are hit the hardest. They become the shock absorbers of all of our crises, and that we're in a moment of polycrisis, as they call it, or the perfect storm of crises in which crisis and inequality are mutually compounding each other. We see all the scales of inequality that have existed for decades become sharper and more pronounced. So just to note that we are in a moment of extreme monetary tightening, where the kind of interest rate hikes are impacting gender inequality as well. When the economy dampens, it impacts women's employment and livelihoods. Inflation crisis today of food and fuel impacts women disproportionately. The kind of economic policies of regressive taxation, taxing goods, services, taxing food products, that impacts poor women the hardest. So every structure of the economy is impacting women in disproportionate ways on the scales of intersectionality. Thanks.
Well, I believe that, as you said just right now, the pandemic has deepened gender inequalities as women had to face, I believe, like 3 crises, right? Like a health crisis, an economic crisis, but also a care crisis. But this doesn't mean that because of the pandemic, the gender inequality will continue to be a manifest destiny for countries. I believe that the states, the governments, can do much to accelerate equality. And in fact, I'm from Argentina. I work at the Ministry of Economy, providing a gender perspective through all the economic policy. And in the last years, we have seen some very interesting changes in Argentina. For example, we got the legal abortion bill. We created a Ministry of Women, Gender, and Diversities. We got 50% of women candidates in national elections as a mandatory thing that all the parties must do when they are in national elections. And we reduce the femicide rates, you see. And all of this was because there was a strong commitment of the government to reduce gender gaps, and a strong feminist movement who push in order to get to these policies and measures. So I would say I'm quite optimistic, because I believe that all times should be times of transformation, and politics have a big role in this transformation.
So, Radhika, if we can start with you. Globally, public and economic policies leave women behind. We know that our system is inequitable by default. It's not equitable by design. For instance, in the US, monetary policy, for instance, the Fed leaves women behind by continuing to hike interest rates. These interest rate hikes are intended to tamper the wage labor-based inflation and slow the job market. Since women are typically the last hired and first fired, they are at the greatest risk of suffering job losses because of the interest rate hikes. I'm going to ask a question about the Global South in a second. But for those people who don't know, I just want to provide a few numbers so that people understand, because what it looks like in the US, and then it can be extrapolated out to almost every other country. So women in the United States, and this will just take a second, but women in the United States have not yet actually recovered from the pandemic. We still have 1.5 million women missing from the labor force since the beginning of the pandemic. This is happening at a time when we have almost 2 jobs open for every 1 person looking for a job. So you have wage inflation. Now we have inflation, and the actual prices for goods and services targeted toward women, to your point, is actually twice that of goods and services targeted toward men. So not only do women have less money coming into their wallets already, they actually have more money coming out of their wallets, right? We know, in addition to that, that the pay gap, so the amount of money coming into women's wallets, has widened by 5 to 11% for every single category of women through an intersectional lens. Now you layer on interest rate hikes, and women, being a woman, is an actual credit risk. We pay higher rates for things like mortgages, for car loans, et cetera. So, and now with interest rate hikes, women will be the first ones that will leave the labor force, and they haven't yet even recovered. That's the context. So people really understand this is a huge economic issue. I mean, in the United States, women have added $2 trillion to the US economy since 1970. This is an issue that's not just about women. This is about everybody, and everybody having economic opportunity. So if you can talk a little bit about, is this the case in the Global South? I'd really love to hear your perspective, and then we're going to come to you.
Those numbers were incredibly useful to really situate where we're at, right? How many women have completely disappeared from the labor force? We don't know, right? Because once you've left, they don't count you anymore. And so globally, I don't think we actually know. I mean, the pandemic was sort of a TV camera, I mean, so many media people, on what the world looks like, right? We saw the images of migrant women in India waiting for trains because there were no jobs, right? It was this great narrowing on visually looking at how messed up this economy is, right? And globally, not just in the US, but the US is a great example. But I think this is a moment, I think your first question was, is this the moment where we're gonna move forward? I think we really need to ask a very simple question. What is the economy for? What is its purpose? And many people over the last 2 days have been talking about human rights and human rights violations in the media. And I forgot the name of the person who yesterday talked about economic and social rights. That's an important part of the human rights framework that I think we need to use to evaluate the economy. How do we make economic policy, and how do we assess whether it's doing well by us, right? And so what if we use economic policy making and assess it using ratified human rights norms? How do we look at inflation targeting? Can we assess inflation targeting by looking at economic policy norms? Human rights norms, non-discrimination and equality. Is this policy going to discriminate against women? Well, then we can assess that policy. Fiscal policy, tax policy. I mean, in the UK, you just had to change a government because of tax policy. Well, if we were able to normatively shift the way we look and assess economic policy, I'm saying human rights norms, but and I'm convinced by it myself, but we need to really shift the way we look at economic policy making and not just use growth and profits as the way to think that an economy is healthy, but well-being, right? How is it about the well-being of humanity? And given that we're the majority of it in terms of women, why don't we use women's position in the economy as the way to assess whether economic policy making is actually doing a difference?
So, Bhumika, you have carried out field research in both Pakistan and Ecuador. Do you have examples from those countries?
I do, but if you bear with me, I'm going to take you on a brief macroeconomic journey on the current moment, because we need to first resonate with exactly what Radhika was saying. What is the economy for? By looking at how gender inequalities are structurally linked to macroeconomic crises. So it has been a little bit surprising to me that in the last 2 days we haven't talked about the sovereign debt crises imploding across the developing world. There is a very stark and severe global South debt crisis happening today, with several countries defaulting on their sovereign debts. Just a quick share of numbers. Debt servicing by developing countries on whole amounts to approximately 25% of total government spending across the global south. Debt servicing from developing countries as a whole is twice that of education spending, 9.5 times that of public health spending, 13.5 times that of social protection spending, and for countries reporting their climate spending in their UNFFC nationally determined contributions, debt servicing is 32 times as high as climate spending. Why are Global South countries spending the vast majority of their scarce and hardly earned public revenues, their public financial monies, on paying the richest creditors on the planet? Private financial markets, investment funds, hedge funds, institutional investors, as well as multilateral banks and the richest countries on the planet are receiving the public financial resources of Global South countries. And where is this debt coming from? Who is this debt actually owed to? So I would say it's owed to the women of developing countries that are actually paying that debt back to the foreign creditors, to the external creditors of the countries. So what is happening across the Global South? Where is this money to repay debt coming from? It's coming from systematic austerity programs. Since 2021, the International Monetary Fund has disbursed 221 loan programs across 88 developing countries. Most of these loan programs of the International Monetary Fund come with austerity measures to restrain public spending, to really cut the fiscal deficit, not just to zero, but to a primary fiscal surplus. This money is for repaying the debt through regressive taxation. So when we talk about gender inequalities, it's tied to the public services that upholds gender equality. Public services upholds climate justice. So in Ecuador, we saw 4,000 public health workers laid off. Like in most developing countries, the vast majority of public health workers, nurses, the auxiliary public hospital workers are women. In Ecuador in particular, 60% of workers in the healthcare sector are women. 85% of nurses are women. The 4,000 public health workers dismissed was at the peak of the pandemic. It started in 2019 and continued to 2020, and it led to Ecuador being flashed across the news in the summer of 2020 as one of the highest mortality numbers in the world. So this is just to show that what is impacting gender inequality, what really shapes the lives and the struggles of women across the Global South is deeply connected to sovereign debt, to fiscal austerity, to regressive taxation, and the role of public services in supporting and upholding gender equality, particularly employment, livelihoods. When there's a lack of public services, that is when informal sector work and very exploitative, unremunerated work happens as well. So gender is structural, it's macroeconomic. There are no separations, and it's systemically interlinked. Thanks.
So you have great examples from Argentina. Can you share some of those with us?
Yeah, I believe that there is another way. I think that the good news is that there is another way, because the Argentine experience shows that if there is a strong commitment from the government with accelerating gender equality, and there is also like a strong consensus from civil society against austerity policies and supporting gender equality, then there is some wiggle room that you wouldn't get otherwise, you see? So in other words, the wiggle room regarding the negotiation with the international labor agencies exists if you push, right? So in Argentina, we have reached an agreement with the IMF, which includes a series of policies which are gender sensitive, such as there are some examples, strengthening the care support system through, social protection program focused on women, improving and increasing the care infrastructure, mostly with childcare facilities, starting by the low-income populations, promoting the inclusion of women and transgender people into the labor market, especially in sectors that are which are strategic right now, such as the automotive industry, such as the mining, such as the IT and knowledge economy. And what I believe that is more important, it guarantees to the allocation of the proper resources in order to achieve these policies, these goals, allocating 15% of the national budget to this end. So if you have a strong feminist movement and a strong commitment from the government, there is another way. I believe that will be the main thing that I would like to say here.
So Fatimah, I'm actually going to direct this at you, and then if others want to jump in afterward. You are implementing and contributing to tangible alternatives to advance gender equality. We need to take both a grassroots and a grass tops approach that is bottom up and top down. We need both forces to unlock the 12 trillion potential opportunity of gender equality. Can you share some examples of successful initiatives and strategies?
I think one of the things I'd like to start with, to be honest, is to stress the importance of what the focus on women's empowerment alone, how problematic that is. I think that's the first thing, because I think before we leave this conversation, that just needs to be stated here. A lot of what we need to do is also about what we shouldn't be doing, right? Women's empowerment is part of a wider system of gender justice and economic justice, and the things that have already been mentioned are critically part of that. So those solutions have actually already started being mentioned. Progressive taxation is the biggest thing right now in Africa that could make an enormous difference to women. The amount of money that leaves the continent as a result of illicit financial flows is, I think, estimated at about 86 billion annually, right? USD. If you think about how much that could contribute to these public services that we're talking about that are currently missing, and let's be clear, Africa is not unfamiliar with austerity. It didn't start with the financial crisis. We were experiencing this from the 80s and 90s with the structural adjustment programs, which was effectively austerity. So they hollowed out our states, they cut our education systems, our health systems. Women lost jobs because the public sector was the biggest employer of women. Our roads deteriorated, and we now then had this created scenario of a lack of capacity, which continually has to be addressed by the international community in one way or another, and a paternalistic view of the continent that then follows. And austerity, since the financial crisis, has just further embedded that to the point where we almost impose austerity on ourselves. Nigeria, for example, slashed its education and health budgets in the summer of 2020, knowing that it was going to be going into a debt crisis. And as Bhumika has outlined, this is essentially what we're looking at. So when we're talking about solutions, we're talking about a variety of things. We're talking about progressive taxation, which means taxing the transnational corporations that are making a lot of money from the fact that Africa is being heavily extracted from and continues to be extracted from. The panels we've had today have talked, for example, about just transitions and green energy. All of that green energy, or a large amount of that green energy, is going to be coming out of the continent of Africa, right? What are the frameworks in place to ensure, A, that exploitation that has dominated the history of the continent actually is put to an end? And there are solutions that are being put forward by movements on the ground, and we're talking about social movements. This moment is a potential catalyst for social movements which have historically brought about change. All of the rights, actually, that we all hold dear today have been on the back of social movements, often at catalytic moments in history, the Second World War being the most obvious one for those of us who are in the UK that led to the creation of the welfare state. But let me just name some of those. So progressive taxation, tax the TNCs, the transnational corporations. Universal social protection is critical, so not safety nets, which are means tested and completely leave out a whole swathe of the population, and decent jobs. The last panel spoke a lot about the importance of decent jobs. So we're not just talking about creating jobs, and we're not just talking about formalizing women's employment, and we know that the vast majority of people are in the informal sector on the continent. We're talking about creating jobs that are secure, that have decent contracts, that are not exploitative, that have, the things that should be there: sick pay, leave, annual leave, maternity leave, decent maternity leave, the right to redress. Because this precarity that we talk about, and I was really taken by your figures actually. One of the things that I found interesting about what you said regarding the rise of the cost of services, well, some would argue that the problem is that those services have been commodified in the first place. And so what that means is that if you do not have the means, and if you are in that precarious position where whenever there's an exogenous shock like what we've had, you fall from your economic grace, effectively, you are now unable to afford a service that should be a fundamental right.
We have, thank you. So we have 4 minutes left, so I'm actually going to move us to our last question and ask, I'd love to hear from all of you, so if we can keep each of you to 30 seconds, that would be great. So there is an interest for all stakeholders, private sector, government, civil society, and media, to accelerate progress toward gender equity. But how do they, and those who are here in our audience, engage with some of the alternative feminist models you have discussed today? Sol, do you want to start?
Well, I believe that by the end of 2021, Argentina, Bolivia, and Paraguay were the only 3 countries in Latin America that recovered the pre-pandemic levels of employment for women. Now, in Argentina, in fact, during the last quarter of 2021, women reached the highest levels of employment in the whole history of our country. Now, that wasn't magic. That was because there was a government, again, committed to the task of accelerating gender equality, but also because there were feminists in the government creating all of these policies. Policies such as, for example, targeting women when you designed the money transfer policies, mothers and single mothers were the first ones to receive, this money transfer during the 2020, and there was a specific policy, the emergency family income, that reached 9 million people in Argentina, and almost 60% of those people were women, no? So that was quite an interesting policy in that sense, but also we created a program in order to register, to formalize domestic workers, which was the main activity of women before the pandemic. We also created more childcare facilities, allocating 10% of the public works ministry resources at that end, the public work ministry creating kindergartens. That was quite unusual. So there are many things that we can do. We can create also, and we did create
And I'm
it.
going to move us on.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
We have only, thank you.
Okay, I will show you
Yeah,
later.
that's okay. Thank you. Thank you. Fatima, and if you can, she's giving me if you can give it to 30 seconds or less, that would be great.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what we've got.
I'll do my best.
It's gonna blink red at me.
Okay,
in a
how
minute.
to engage. Okay, I think one of the things that's come through quite strongly is the importance of national sovereignty, actually, and sovereign policy decisions. So we have to fight for that collectively. Collective organizing has been one of the most powerful feminist economic alternative, I suppose, principles that we work with, and we see that. So looking at those movements, I could name a few. The Right to Say No movement, which effectively stopped mining in South Africa, a community organized, led quite heavily by women. The We Are the Solution organization in Senegal, which did such effective work as a farmer collective to bring about a transition to agroecology within the Senegalese government. It's now part of their plan.
Right.
The final
I'm gonna
things I
move
will
it.
say very quickly is to not capture the narrative of of gender equality and feminist movements and instrumentalize it into something that will eventually just replicate this current unequal system. That has been our biggest battle for the past 20 years, and we're still fighting it.
Go ahead.
Okay, I think I have 0 minutes. Okay, 3 seconds. I think to piggyback on Fatima's things about national sovereignty, I think we also need to think about the economy as a global economy, and that the power right now is in the financial sector. And yesterday, I think someone talked about extraterritorial obligations when it comes to the media. We need extraterritorial obligations in terms of who runs this economy. The financial sector is disciplining national governments, and we need to figure out how to legislate those financial sectors. I mean, you know, when people say the market spoke, who is that? It's a bunch of dudes doing things on a computer, right? So the market doesn't speak. It's our economy, and we need to create it in the way in which it performs what we need it to do for our well-being.
Thank you.
I know we have no time, so really, absolutely 3 quick things. Writing on exactly regulating the financial sector, regulating financialization. Today we are seeing a very new resurgence, not necessarily new, but it's a resurgence and a strengthening and a reproduction of financial power, because we are seeing the climate emergency will be met by a kind of financialization of where, you know, it's called leveraging private climate finance. And this is going to be really important to regulate so that it actually meets the kind of climate needs that impact gender inequality so structurally. We also need a debt restructuring mechanism in terms of a concrete way to regulate the power of finance that impacts austerity. And a third, certainly last but not least, we need to really put an end to the kind of fiscal austerity measures that erode public services that we saw in the pandemic impacting gender inequality so severely. So public services meaning health, education, social protection, pensions, as well as in developing countries, roads, infrastructure, access to water and sanitation, housing. So not just regulating, but really creating the kind of society we need through public financing for public services that meet gender equality needs equitably. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.